This afternoon, my name's Muldoon, I'm from Twitter. I'm over from San Francisco for a few weeks, and this is actually my last week in Sydney. It's been brilliant to get back to Sydney. This afternoon I'm going to take some time to share with you about how we think about building high-performance teams. Before I wanted to do that though, because I'm going to focus on the people in this talk, I wanted to focus on you for a minute and just learn a little bit about who's in the audience. So if you would with me, I'd love to get a show of hands. First and foremost, who here is a Scrum Master? Oh, a good chunk of the audience. Okay, thank you. That's like over half the audience. Who here has the title Agile Coach, is coaching? Oh, a few as well, like maybe 10% of the audience. Any engineers? Yep, okay. And product owners? Ooh. Not very many product owners in the audience. Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Second question, can I just get a show of hands? Company is less than 50 people. Handful. Company is 50 to 500 people. Okay, about 20%. And companies over 500 people. Yeah, okay, cool. The bulk of the audience. Super. Thank you. So we're going to focus on the people, right? There's a ton of stuff that we could talk about at Scrum Australia. You've probably heard a lot about different methods over the past 2 days. I wanted to focus on the people because in our quest to scale at Twitter and grow our product and engineering organisation, we've found that people is the key component. And when we talk about people, we added over 1,000 people to our product and engineering group in 2013. And so we saw some quite rapid growth in that group, and hence it's pretty front of mind for me as we now bring in more practice process around our people and how we manage that and approach that. So let's dive in and take a look at that. Big disclaimer up front, I should actually say, this is an experience report. It's what we've done at Twitter. It's some of the things that we struggled with at Twitter. Some of the things that we're experimenting with today. There was a great talk yesterday afternoon by Bernd Schiffer. He talked about experimentation. He gave some very interesting examples. But what I'm recommending that you do is take from Scrum Australia, learn from what others have done and experiment on your own organisation. Like Pete Steele was talking about product experimentation with A/B tests, we run that sort of experimentation with practices and processes within our company. We don't automatically assume that because it worked for company X, it's going to work for Twitter. So we're trying to learn from others, experiment with it, tweak it, and apply it to our own problems. And I'd encourage you to do the same. So with that, what is a high-performance team? When we think about high-performance teams at Twitter, we're looking at these 4 traits. We think about teams that have impact, that deliver quality, that have flow, and that exhibit Kaizen. So when we think about impact, it's teams that are delivering value to their customer, whoever their customer happens to be. When we think about quality, we want teams to be minimising waste. We don't want them to throw some junk out there, run an experiment, and have to rewrite everything later because it was not suitable in the first place. We like teams to be thinking about the flow of work, so small chunks of work so that they can learn from the customer as opposed to a long-term big bang release, at which point the customer might not be happy with the result. The key thing though that we look in our high-performance teams that we're looking for is Kaizen, this quest to continually improve. We want to see the teams that are constantly inspecting how they work, experimenting with how they work, and finding better ways of working and delivering value to their customer. Can I do another quick survey? Can I get a show of hands? Who here has been on a team that you consider high performance with whatever traits it has? Okay, that's pretty cool, like a fair chunk of the audience. One of the other attendees here, a gentleman said to me over lunch, you know, he had a high performance team and he had bonds so good that he's got new brothers, right? That's how he described high performance teams. Right? They were bonds so good that he had new brothers out of this. They still catch up for dinner on a regular basis. And I thought that was really interesting because here I am talking about the traits of high performance. this is not about the people, but there's this other aspect to high-performance teams that really, well, it is about the people, but it's not about the, I suppose, the passion. And I think back to high-performance teams that I've worked on in the past and had the great pleasure to work with. In fact, one of the people that I worked with in the past is in this room. And it was a great honour to be part of that high-performance team. And so what we're trying to do is show other teams at Twitter, help them attain these traits, but also show them how cool a high-performance team can be. So just as an aside, when we think about high-performance teams, when we think about scaling at Twitter, we recognise that Scrum is part of the solution. Scrum is not the solution, right? It's not the only thing that we turn to. If you looked at the 40 methods in 40 minutes that Craig Smith talked about yesterday, you know that there's a whole wealth of experience and knowledge out there that we can pull on. And obviously, building great individual Scrum teams is easy. Building a number of Scrum teams that work well together is it's harder, but it's still easy. But what we've found as we've grown the company, having Scrum teams and having many high-performance Scrum teams, it becomes less and less about the team and more about optimizing the company and making sure that the whole company can support these high-performance Scrum teams. We're more interested in optimizing the whole organization rather than the individual teams themselves. And indeed, the company needs to change the way that we operate to support these teams. So this afternoon, we're going to take a look at 4 key areas. We're going to take a look at how we hire amazing people, how we unleash the productivity for those people, we review their performance, provide those individuals feedback, and indeed those teams feedback, and finally how we improve the flock. Incidentally, the flock is what we call ourselves. Every Twitter employee, I'm a tweep. We're all tweeps. Together, the tweeps form the flock, right? And so we're trying to improve the flock over time. So these are the things that we're going to touch on this afternoon. And the first one that we're going to look at is hiring amazing people. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we grew tremendously last year. We added over 1,000 individuals just to our product engineering org. And so it was very important to us to maintain a quality bar for the people that we were hiring. Now, obviously, there's exceptions to that quality bar because they let me join the company. But having said that, we're trying to keep the bar very high all the time. Otherwise, there's this decline over time as the company grows. And that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, the responsibility for hiring great people does not fall on the hiring manager. In fact, it doesn't even fall on the team. The responsibility for hiring great people is actually worn across the whole organisation. We're all responsible for making sure that we make the best hires. And so we have some practices and processes in place to help us do that. So we've got roles and ladders. Now this is not new. You have roles in your organisation: software engineer, site reliability engineer, designer, product owner, etc., etc. In addition to the roles, we have ladders. Our ladders aren't around years of tenure or anything like that. Our ladders are around experience related to competencies. I'll touch on in a minute. This is really important for us to make sure that when we're hiring for a particular team, we're hiring the right role, obviously, but also the right level of experience. And so if we look at someone like a software engineer, we have SWE 1, SWE 2, senior software engineer, staff software engineer, all the way up to a fellow, software engineering fellow. We have these 8 levels of software engineers so that we know where do people fit in and what's the composition and mix of our teams across the organisation. Do we want to have more investment in some more junior people in one area of the organisation? How does that translate to greater performance and velocity over time? It's certainly something that we think about. When this becomes really important is alongside the competencies. Now, obviously, competence is the set of the ability of an individual to do a job properly. When we talk about the competencies, however, we're talking about this defined set of behaviours that we want to see of our people. And so for every role and every level on the ladder for that particular role, we have expected competencies, behaviours that this individual should exhibit. And this helps us in identifying candidates for Twitter. It also helps us for the performance reviews that we'll touch on later, and also developing people. So this is really important for us, the competencies. Just to give you an example of some competencies, we have 6 buckets here: collaboration, ownership, problem solving, etc. These examples actually come from our mobile platform group under the leadership of an engineering director, Rich Perret. He was instrumental in pushing forward competencies. This is actually one of the areas that we experimented with within a part of the engineering organisation and have rolled out more broadly across the organisation. But you can see here some of the behaviours that we like to see. Work collaboratively, act independently, seek to simplify, pick up the trash, right? So it's, we're working together. Team-oriented, helpful, friendly, put the goals of the team ahead of themselves. Now, these behaviours that we see of people, these have become really important for us. The behaviours were not something that we did until recently. The competencies weren't something that we did until recently, and it actually came about because we were hiring very strong technical individuals, or we were finding candidates, in fact, that were very strong technical candidates, but in the actual workplace and in the interview process, they didn't exhibit the behaviours of customer focus or empathy for the customer. They didn't exhibit the behaviour that led us to believe that they'd be able to collaborate well with their teammates or indeed with other teams. And so one of the areas that these competencies came out of was trying to find a better, well-rounded tweep to join the flock. So we have these competencies for each role, each level of the ladder, and obviously as you're progressing up the ladder, the competencies may change. For instance, I would expect, if we just go back here, I would expect that a competency of someone that's a senior software engineer is going to be entirely different to a principal software engineer, for instance. A principal software engineer is going to be spending a lot of time across many teams as opposed to focused on one particular team and coaching and bringing up the more junior software engineers, for instance. So we leverage the roles, the ladder, and the competencies as part of our hiring process. Now, the hiring process, I've heard some people describe it as fairly thorough, but I think it's actually pretty common in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. We have 3 channels for people really, or for candidates really coming into Twitter, and that is, first and foremost, a sourcer. We will have a recruiter in-house that will go out and find candidates that they believe meet the role, the ladder, and the competencies that we're looking for a particular team. We have tweeps that will refer their friends to a particular position that's available. And finally, we have people that approach Twitter and say, hey, I'd like to work for Twitter for this particular position that's available. Now, a recruiter will phone screen these candidates. They want to sense the candidate. Do they really exhibit some of these behaviours? Hard to find in a phone screen from a recruiter, perhaps, but we're trying to get a sense for that. And ultimately, from that, the resume will go to the hiring manager for that team, and they'll get a stream or a pipeline of resumes that will come through. Now, the hiring manager, one of the things that they are responsible for is putting together a hiring panel. So as a hiring manager, and if I'm hiring a software engineer, perhaps I'm hiring a senior software engineer, I want to have a panel of people that include other senior software engineers from the team, senior or staff software engineers from other teams, perhaps in my group of the business, other roles like product manager or designer, things like that. So we want to have, again, a broad range of people that are on this panel that are providing feedback and thoughts about the particular candidate. Candidates will go through 2 phone screens. They get through 2 phone screens. They'll come on site and they'll do 6 or 7 interviews back to back, broken up by lunch. And again, depending on the role, the hiring manager will actually ask individual members of the hiring panel what they are going to be focused on in the particular interview. Now, this in and of itself is not particularly exciting, but I think one of the things that's exciting for us is where we're experimenting at the moment. Has anyone here had exposure to or experience with top grading? Okay, cool. So this might be interesting to you. In our quest to constantly improve our hiring process and make sure we are bringing the best talent into Twitter, we're actually experimenting at the moment with this practice called top grading. So top grading is a structured interview process, and as part of the phone screens, the on-site interviews, things like that, right in the middle of that on-site interview, we actually have a pair of interviews. And so myself and a colleague will interview a candidate, And again, we're looking at the roles, the ladder, the competencies for this particular position that we're interviewing for. And we're basically doing an interview together alongside each of these competencies to identify, does this person exhibit the behaviours that we're looking for? And the way that we do it is to ask of every role the candidate has had since they left university, for instance. You know, we're probably not going to ask them, hey, tell me about your paper run. What were you hired to do in this role? But essentially every job that they've had, every role that they've had after university, we will go and query them and we will ask them these same questions. The goal of which is to identify the patterns that we see in their behaviours in each of these different roles. What accomplishments are you most proud of in this role? Do we see any patterns there? What were some low points during that job? Do we see any patterns here? How do they relate to the behaviours that we're looking for out of our people? A low point was, oh, look, you know, it was always terrible dealing with this other team, the next role they had. Oh, we struggled with working across teams. Oh, okay, so we're seeing a pattern. How does that fit against the behaviours that we're seeking for this particular position? Why did you leave that job? In fact, one of the key things out of this, the fourth question there, who are the people you worked with? Specifically, who was your manager? What's the manager's name? Spell the manager's name for me. What's their phone number? What's their email address? We're going to reach out to this manager and do a reference check on you. So this is quite a thorough interview. While I'm asking the questions of all of these roles, my colleague is making thorough notes about the answers. Not writing down what the candidate said, but actually going through and making their notes and their assessment of the candidate's responses. And after this interview, the colleague and I, we will go through and we will assess and look at the feedback and say, ultimately, does this make sense for this particular position? Are we making a hiring decision or are we not? Now, one of the things that will happen at that final, the final step in the hiring process is to make sure that the whole hiring panel comes together. It might be for 15 minutes, it might be 30 minutes, depending on scores and feedback and things like that. But they will give all that feedback to the hiring manager so that the hiring manager can make a decision, have those discussions, answer any questions, and ultimately as a company, all of the people in this hiring panel are taking responsibility for this hire. It's not like, yeah, they're good, they're a 3-4, I'd hire them. It's like, no, like we need to be sure that this is the right person for the company, for the role, for the position that we're hiring for. So that touches on how we hire amazing people. Roles and ladders and the competencies are very important to make sure that we understand what we're looking for a particular position, the behaviours that we're seeking. We've got that structured hiring process. We understand how everyone flows through it. Everyone goes through the same process. And of course, at the moment, we're experimenting with top grading to see how we can get better candidates through this process and build a better flock. The next aspect that I wanted to touch on was unleashing productivity and how do we make sure that all these new hires that we bring on are the most productive tweaks that we can have. So, first thing that we do is flight school. Every bird's got to get off the ground, every bird's got to learn to fly, right? Incidentally, everything at Twitter is named after a bird. Ostrich is a Scala runtime monitoring service. We've got Ibis. Ibis is a notification service. Turns out there's like 9,900 and something different bird species. So we've got a lot of headroom to go. But yes, we have flight school. And so flight school is our way of getting every new employee into the business and up to speed as quickly as possible. It's basically a brain dump, right? We take a week and we send these new employees through, you know, day one is very much, okay, here's your office, there's the bathrooms, here's the cafeteria, security, blah, 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 right? Like it's fairly entry-level stuff, but it ramps up throughout week one. At the end of day one, you actually go back and you sit with your team. So if I'm a software engineer or a Scrum Master starting at Twitter, I would be picked up at the end of the day by my manager. They'll take me to my team, introduce me to my team. I'm sitting with my team from that point on, but I'm actually not really interacting with my team a lot. For the first week specifically, and indeed for the first few weeks, I spend more time with my cohort. Every Monday we will have flight school kicks off every Monday, and you might have 20 or 30 people in a flight school cohort, and they will be actually beyond just engineering. You'll have sales, marketing, recruitment. You'll have people from across the whole company together. So you're building these bonds across the company, which is really valuable. But as flight school progresses, you go into your specific curriculum. You go into your sales curriculum. You go into your software engineering curriculum, your site reliability engineer curriculum, whatever it happens to be. The goal of this is to make sure that people understand why we do what we do, not just what we do, right? So if we just tell people, well, we do this, so, this is part of our practice, that's great. But what we're actually trying to leave these people with as quickly as possible is why we've made these decisions in the past that have led us to operate in this fashion. Specifically for engineering, product engineering, we have DevProd, or developer productivity. This is a group of engineers that are focused on the build, test, deploy lifecycle. They're doing all the tooling around that, and their goal is to make sure that the cohort, all their colleagues, I should say, in Twitter engineering are as productive as possible. So obviously this is a very high leverage role, right? When you're talking about 30, 40 people now that are trying to make decisions around build, test, deploy tooling that affect over 1,000 engineers that work in 20 odd different languages, from Erlang to Scala to Java on Android, Objective-C, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a very different environment across the organization depending on the particular service and product that you're working on. But indeed, this team is very high leverage, trying to make sure that everyone is productive as possible. The way that we measure productivity in this sense is actually, it's perhaps kind of crude, but we use cycle time. And we're not looking at cycle time from when something was on the backlog, for instance, but generally we look at from when we moved something in progress and when we said, okay, what's the time to get it from in progress to code review? That's engineering. We want that to be small. But then how long does it take to get code reviews? How much time do we spend in code review? How can we get that cycle time for the code review portion down, lower? Do we want to get it down lower because does that hurt our quality? So that's a trade-off. How do we get our build time reduced? How do we reduce our build time? How do we spin up more CI agents so that we can reduce our build time? How do we improve deployment? How do we improve deployment so that we can roll out across an entire cluster or across the whole production instance as effectively as possible? How do we roll back? Because if we can roll back faster, if we need to roll back, then of course this all impacts on developer productivity. So this is actually it's a really interesting space for Twitter. I dare say that it's one that we're really only scratching the surface of, because we've grown in a way that we've got so much different technology across the organization. You can't make one change for improving deployment of Python or improving deployment from this repo and get that across the whole organization, but it is certainly very high leverage. The other thing that we've done as we've scaled is introduce principles. Now you can think of things like the lean principles. They're really great guiding principles. These principles are actually things that have come bottom up from the teams themselves at Twitter, from the team leads, from the engineering managers and things like that. What we found over time is, as we've grown, it was, well, I've got a Scrum team, but this team over here, they don't seem to, they don't have a board, they don't, it's, how do we work together? So the principles for us are really, you could think of them as akin to the enterprise architecture principles, right? They're kind of like these guiding things that help us understand how we work together at Twitter. And as I say, they're bottom up, developed bottom up, but now they're being pushed back down and constantly updated and referred to by the leaders, so that the leaders are pushing that. Hey, that doesn't sound like it aligns with our principles. You guys came up with the principles. I'm merely holding you accountable to living up to those principles. For an example, we don't talk about Scrum. We don't say that, our principle is not we have Scrum teams, for instance. We talk about iterative team-based development, small teams. We're not saying that they're teams of 8 people or less than 10, but we have small teams, stable teams. They live together for a long period of time. Now, in our minds, we generally think of things like teams that are less than 10 people. We think of stable teams as being teams that are together for for 12 or 18 months. Lightweight planning techniques. Okay, again, we're not specifying how we do this, but we do have these principles that we can look to a team and see their roadmap, see their charter. Other things that we talk about are consistency. right? If one team's decided to pick a JavaScript library and the rest of the organization's using another JavaScript library, we'd err on the side of consistency across JavaScript libraries, or libraries, whatever library it is, rather than having a different library, unless there was a really good reason to. Flexibility, you know, we think of generalists or T-shaped people, cross-functional teams. We think of cross-functional teams all the way down. You know, even in our infrastructure operations world, you have a cross-functional team that might include someone from procurement, or, you know, perhaps someone that can provide some legal advice, things like that. Just as a sidebar on the principles, one of the issues that we faced that I think we've done a pretty good job of addressing now is optimizing individuals over optimizing the whole. So we've changed to this approach where leveraging the principles, we're optimizing the whole. There was a tendency, and perhaps going back to hiring strong individuals, like strong technically capable individuals, as opposed to individuals that had the technical chops as well as custom empathy and the ability to collaborate. What we saw was that we were optimizing individuals. And in fact, I remember one, this is quote from one engineering manager, "Well, I'm optimizing for hands-on keyboard." I was like, oh, this is very interesting. You're optimizing for hands-on keyboard. I'm optimizing for value to our customers. How do we have, you know, how have we approached this from such different angles? And so having these strong individuals resulted in a hero culture. What we're breaking away from is those strong individuals in the hero culture and building a much more collaborative culture as a result. And in fact, doing that forces us to optimize for the team, and going beyond the team forces us to optimize for a group, for product and engineering, and indeed for the whole company. So this has actually been very valuable for us over the past 6 or 8 months, that new focus on, and renewed focus, I should say, on optimizing for the whole company. It's had a huge impact on our scale of engineering organization. The final thing that we do for unleashing productivity is the methods. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Craig Smith, he touched on 40 methods in 40 minutes. There's a whole host of methods that are out there. We train people in 2 methods specifically, Scrum and Kanban. The bulk of our consumer engineering is actually using Scrum. It works very well with 2-week sprints. It works very well with the release cycle for things like our iOS and Android apps, and the release train that goes out with those to both the App Store and the Play Store. But having a large and fast-growing product and engineering org means that people come in with this, well, I've done Agile in the past. You know, I was on an Agile team before, and we say, oh, can you describe that a little bit for us? Oh, yeah, well, you know, we'd be working weekends, and you know, we never hit, you know, what we set out to achieve in a sprint, and da da da. Oh, okay. So what we actually have done, because we have teams that are in an operations world, very much flow-focused, responsive, like our site reliability engineers, our customer service agents, things like that. They're much better suited to Kanban. The product development teams, very well suited to Scrum. We actually train everyone on both, because even as a software engineer working on a product team, without a doubt, I'm going to be spending some time with someone in operations, so it's good to understand how they work and what sort of method they use to get their work done on a day-to-day basis, or customer support, whatever it is, and vice versa. Even little things, incidentally, like sprint versus iteration, you wouldn't probably think that that'd have a big impact, but just making sure that everyone's using the same language makes everything a heck of a lot more effective. You know, you don't have to go into a planning meeting and oh, well, what about this and what about that? Just get all that out of the way. And so I don't need to touch on that too much. To suffice to say, we train Scrum, Kanban, Lean principles, and we're making sure that everyone has a well-rounded understanding, but we're not prescribing anything as per our principles. So, unleashing productivity. We've got flight school. Every new tweak goes through flight school. Then you go into a curriculum specific for your particular role. We've got DevProd, a group of people focused on making sure that the cycle time from going from writing some code to getting it into production is as low as possible. We've got the principles, again, bottom up, and now being, you know, brought top down again for accountability, to help us, guide us in how we work with one another and work in the organisation. And finally, the methods, not prescriptive, giving people the knowledge that they can choose their own method and helping them make the right decision. So from there, how do we review performance of individuals, teams, etc., and how do we get feedback to these teams? I'm sure everyone here probably does some form of 360-degree review, pretty standard across the industry, certainly in Silicon Valley. We do these on every 6 months. We do these. This actually forms part of the remuneration and promotion cycle. They're pretty well regarded at Twitter. Like, they seem to get a bad rap, but everyone seems to enjoy them, although everyone does go, oh gosh, I got a lot of requests for reviews. Generally what will happen is I will send out a request for perhaps 4 or 5 people to provide me feedback. My manager might add 1 or 2 people that they would like to get feedback from about me, and everyone has a week to provide this feedback. So we keep it a really tight schedule for this. It does disrupt somewhat for people in management roles or people management roles, but it means that we get it done quickly and it's not too onerous over a long period of time. The one that I think is really interesting for me is our objectives key results. This is something that we focus on for the team specifically, and then we go up to the group and indeed up to the whole company. So objectives key results are actually formulated by Andy Grove at Intel back in the day. You can read more about them in his book, High Output Management. The way that we approach this at Twitter is that every quarter teams will set their objectives key results. And so when we talk about objectives key results, the objectives are these high impact long-term goals that the team wants to achieve. They're stable over a number of quarters. So I might have an objective that lasts for 12 or 18 months, right? And every quarter I've got that same objective on my team, or in fact, same group of objectives on my team's OKRs. Now the KRs, the key results, these are quantifiable, measurable outcomes that help our customers, whoever for your particular team that customer happens to be. So these are metrics that you're setting that you set quarterly. Now, it might not be that you change the metric that you're trying to achieve on a quarter-to-quarter basis. So for instance, if this quarter I had a key result that was reduce the mean time to recovery of an outage by 10%, next quarter, I would probably have something like reduce the mean time to recover by 5%, like assuming it's going to get harder for me to make incremental improvements over time. The OKRs help us answer 2 key questions. Where am I going over time? And how do I know when I'm going to get there? Or how do I know how I'm going on the way there? As I said, these are at the team, group, and company level. And in fact, what happens is the company objectives, key results, they come out. And you've got a longer term roadmap into those, or a longer term horizon into the objectives, key results. And the groups will set off the company ones, the teams indeed off the groups, and that's the way that we've managed to align all the teams in the organisation around achieving the company objectives. So it's been tremendously valuable for us. However, it wasn't without its pain. Early on in the piece, we actually found that teams were not writing key results. Now, I mentioned that a key result might be something like reduce the mean time to recover from an outage by 10%. So if the mean time to recover from an outage was 60 minutes, we want to reduce that down. Instead, what we found is that teams were putting their backlog items, perhaps their epics, onto their key results. So instead of saying reduce the mean time to recover, they would say roll out Puppet 3. Okay, Puppet 3 is going to be, or roll out new version of Service X, or add this feature, whatever it happened to be. Now, while it might be great to roll out Puppet 3 or add this, new feature, whatever it is, we don't really care so much about that. What we care about is the outcomes that the customers are getting, right? And so we really brought this all the way back to what are the objectives and how do we help people, how do we help teams write effective key results? So if you look at an example here, these objectives, build a world-class product engineering team, objective drive industry-leading end-user quality standards. These are 2 objectives that are going to be long-lived, right? We're not going to get rid of these objectives in 3 months' time. Next quarter, we're not going to suddenly decide, well, we don't need to have industry-leading end-user quality standards. We did that one. No, this is something that we've got to be constantly on top of. And if you look at the key results themselves under the objective, you can see resiliency. Reduced top-line failure rate from X% to Y%. 50% of traffic served from a new service with 5 nines SLA. You know, these are the sort of things that we can measure. They're metrics that we can go out and measure and grade ourselves on. Well, we didn't get 50% of our traffic served from new service, but we did get 35% of the traffic served from the new service. So how are we going to grade ourselves? Now, because we've got this, and because these OKRs are in front of the whole company, because we have complete transparency into every team's OKRs, every quarter when we set OKRs, we're also reviewing the grading for the last quarter's OKRs. Now, we don't care if Team A delivered feature X. What we really care about is that Team A achieved outcome Y for their customer, whoever that customer happens to be. So this has been very useful. Incidentally, stretch gets used here a lot. You know, or you might have heard the term sandbagging. We really don't have that problem. You know, as I say, the problem that we had was we were getting backlog items in there, and that was an education thing that we had to change. But we don't have this problem where we see sandbagging. People are really striving and stretching and pushing themselves and their teams to achieve as much as possible. So it might be that their grading is actually quite poor because they've overextended themselves. They're pushing themselves or their teams further than they can actually achieve. So that's a problem that we see as well. Finally, we have a pulse survey. The pulse survey, much like the 360-degree reviews that we do for individuals, this is something that goes out twice a year. The pulse survey asks questions of every employee. Again, it's something that is very lightweight. It doesn't take a long time to complete. You basically 15 minutes and you're done. Things like, I understand the company's objectives, key results. I understand the objectives, key results of my team. You know, Twitter is a place I'd like to work at. I see myself working at 12 months from now. I would recommend Twitter as a place to work. So we're looking at a couple of different things, from the goals of, you know, your particular team to management and how your manager performs, and your relationship with your manager, to also the company level. You know, how's the company going? How do you feel about the company? We call it the pulse because it's, you know, it's giving us that health check on the employees, on the tweeps, and how we're going and how everyone's feeling. Incidentally, I think the greatest thing that has happened here is that we actually have a group called Learning and Development. They run the pulse survey, but they are not responsible for all of the action items that come out of this. The leadership, the operating committee, is responsible for that. And when things have been flagged, or have come out of a pulse survey, the leadership committee, or the operating committee I should say, has actually gone out and tackled them and addressed them and been able to stand up in front of the company and say, hey, 6 months ago you said such and such and such and such. Today we've got the results from pulse survey, you know, middle of 2014, and they tell us that we've addressed that problem, right? So it's really encouraging to have that quick feedback cycle for the individuals in the company to see that things are changing. And of course, across a whole company, it does take a while to change some of these things. Actually, just on this, one of the things that came up was my manager, one of the questions we ask is, my manager gives me actionable feedback to improve my performance, right? And probably 18 months ago, or a little bit longer, like January 2013 or something like that, the managers kind of in engineering were getting, not in non-engineering, but in engineering, we're kind of getting slaughtered here. Managers weren't giving actionable feedback to their team members to help them improve. And one of the programs that came out of that, and it's interesting, I didn't even think about it till now, I should have included it, but it's actually called Twitter Core 5. And Twitter Core 5 was a program designed for managers across the company, but it was really around how to give feedback to your people, how to have coaching conversations with your people, how to have open and honest conversations and build trust with your people. And so that was it was a program that came out of results from the Pulse survey. And so because the company could point back and say, hey, you know, we had this problem in, say, let's say it was January 2013. We had this problem that was flagged in the Pulse survey. We introduced a program. We put all of our people managers through this program over a period of 12 months. And now, 18 months later, we've looked at our results again and we're getting much better scores. And that's what's giving the tweeps the confidence to go out and flag issues in the company. The tweeps have we have a lot of faith in our leaders that they will make the right decisions and improve the organisation. So we talked about performance reviews, feedback at Twitter, the individual feedback, the OKRs, objectives, key results for the team, the group and the company level, and finally how we're going at improving the company with the Pulse survey twice a year. Ultimately, we are holding ourselves accountable for this stuff, right? We've got to give that open, honest feedback to make sure that we can improve. Improving the flock. So obviously feedback, reviewing performance and feedback is key to improving the flock, but we have a number of other aspects or activities that we use to improve the flock, and I wanted to look at those with you now. First and foremost is women in engineering. WOMENG, as it's known within the company, is a very important activity for us. Today, in Twitter engineering, Twitter product engineering, we have a ratio of, we have less than 15% of product and engineering women. And today, in North America, 12% of computer science graduates are women, right? So there's obviously something that we need to address in our group at Twitter, but there's also something that we need to address more broadly in how we encourage women, girls and women to get into the field of engineering. And so this is really interesting for me because when I was born, women represented 37% of CS graduates. Today it's down to 12%. Now what we know from research is that more diverse teams actually lead to higher performance teams. Go figure, you have less groupthink, you've got more ideas, more perspective, all that sort of stuff. Interestingly enough, just anecdotal evidence, I believe that the women that we have generally have a lot more empathy for our customer, whoever that customer happens to be, and that's one of the great things that we see in the teams as well. So we have a team called WOMENG. It's made up of men and women, but they focus on all sorts of activities and events, going to things like the Grace Hopper Conference, to try and encourage more women to get into computer science, and indeed trying to encourage more women to explore Twitter as a place to work. One of the other programs that we're involved in is called Girls Who Code. And Girls Who Code, it's a program Twitter's been involved in for a couple of years now, but it's really working at the high school level with 15, 16-year-old girls. And one of the things that we host at Twitter, and in fact a number of other companies like Square, I believe Salesforce, PayPal, a few other companies in the Bay Area host, is a summer immersion program. So for 3 months, you've got a group of 25 to 30 girls, 15, 16-year-olds that are on their summer holidays, and they come and they spend 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the Twitter office, and they learn. It's kind of like flight school. I suppose it's kind of like flight school they basically learn everything, right? But they're not learning about Twitter per se. They're learning about how do you build product? How do you think about the customer? How do you explore design? They go on tours to things like the Computer History Museum down in Mountain View, and they meet with women across all companies in the Bay Area. And so this is a program that's been, it's actually been really successful because at the end of this program they do a project. So they form teams, hopefully they're high performance teams, but they form teams, they don't have a lot of time, and they work on a project together. And at the end of this program, the immersion program, they demo their projects to, in fact, Twitter and a whole lot of other people that get invited along. The interesting thing out of this is a couple of startups have formed out of this. So you've got these 15, 16-year-old girls who are going to go back to school, but also have a startup on the side, and hopefully have a much greater appreciation for what it's like to work in a tech company. And fingers crossed in a few years' time, they'll be coming back and knocking on our door to get a role with us as well, which would be super. The other thing that's tremendously valuable, I could do a sidebar on this, retrospectives. Like everyone here does retrospectives, right? Is there anyone here that's never run a retrospective? Yeah, okay, cool. 12, 18 months ago, if I'd asked a group of people at Twitter, have you run a retrospective? Do you know what it is? No one, they may have had some idea of what a retrospective was. Oh, we get around, we have a chat or something like that. Do you bring tea? You know, but no one had ever run one. And so we basically went on a crash course. We had a whole day off-site, and we did a crash course with 150 odd engineering managers on a number of things, but retrospectives was one of them. How do you run retrospectives? How do you run effective retrospectives? What are the different types of retrospectives? How do you get the best value out of this? How do you encourage the team to have trust? This was actually, incidentally, since we did this, I've probably run in excess of 200 retrospectives. The way that we approach this today is that, for instance, if I was to facilitate a retrospective for Jason's team over here, Jason would then be expected to run a retrospective for a third team, and I would observe and provide feedback, and then finally Jason would be off on running on his own, running retrospectives for other teams. We find obviously that we want to have Jason to be involved in his own retrospective, not running the retrospective. So we're cross-pollinating like that, and that's been very effective. But we don't do it within the groups. We do it across groups. So someone from infrastructure operations will run a retrospective for someone in consumer. You're that impartial third party. You can ask, some really simple questions, things like that. But it's been very valuable for us to identify these opportunities for continuous improvement. And interestingly enough, it was one of those things that we never did historically, which was quite a surprise. These days, we actually have Twitter University. So Twitter got really, we needed to amp up this learning and improve things. So in July last year, we actually acquired a training company. This company had 15 trainers. They'd go out, they'd train all over the world, North America, Europe, Australia. We bought the company and we brought them in-house, and we said, all we want you to do for the time being is train up our people. You've been doing training for us on Scala, Android, iOS, et cetera. We want you to focus exclusively on tweeps. And so they themselves became tweeps, and they've been invested in building Twitter University since then. There's actually two components to Twitter University. Today we have the internal component, and we also have the external component, which is very much focused on training and events around our open source, or the open source projects that we support. Obviously, we want to encourage more people to explore the open source projects, contribute to the open source projects, so we provide training for that. But internally, the thing that's really fascinating is what I'll focus on here. It's how we make tweeps better at all of these competencies and behaviours we talked about before. From things like collaboration to things like languages. So these are just some of the example courses that we have. If you look at things like Scala Essentials, Android Essentials, they're 5-day classes. You basically drop out of your team. You might be an iOS engineer, for instance, and you drop out of your team and you go spend 5 days learning Scala. And sometimes people, well, what's the relevance to that? Like, I'm still going to be working in Objective-C when I get back. But you've got a much greater appreciation for what's going on in the service stack below you. You may be able to contribute to that, do code reviews, and actually move through the stack as well. Other things like Scala Check Essentials, that'll be a couple of hours. Android Accessibility, a couple of hours. Agile Essentials is a 3-hour course. These other ones, a couple of hour courses. How to build a service at Twitter. Twitter Futures. So we probably have in the order of 80 or 100 different courses at Twitter today. They're all run by tweeps, so I can put myself forward and say, in fact, one of the best things that we did when we started Twitter University, we had these 15 trainers that came in, but we said, who else here wants to train? Like, who else here wants to teach other people about something you're passionate about? Oh yeah, I'll do a Mandarin class, or like we do ESL classes through Twitter University. We now have the Twitter Core 5 I mentioned before via Twitter University. Management classes. We have improv classes, which is a pretty cool one. There's a whole host of stuff, and you can just take time out of your day, time out of your week. Obviously, make sure you let the team know in sprint planning, but take time out and go and attend one of these courses so that we're making the whole flock a lot better at what are these behaviours we want to see, how do we solve customer problems, design, etc., etc. All of these courses are available through a tool that we built internally, and every day there's probably 10 to 20 different courses that are available. So we have big TVs around the office, and they are advertising the courses that are coming up. Not necessarily today's courses, but the courses that you can sign up for next week. So you will go sign up for a course. At the conclusion of a course, you will actually provide NPS, so you'll provide feedback on that course, which enables us to identify who are the good trainers, Where's the good content? How can we align the good trainers with the good content, build the Twitter University team, things like that. It's been tremendously effective. One of the other things that we actually deliver via Twitter University is Tech Talks. Tech Talks are presented by external people, so we will get Facebook, Google, Netflix, you know, any company in the Bay Area, someone that's flying through San Francisco. And in fact, we provide this all over the world, right? Like there's classes that are going on in Dublin, Boston, London, wherever, right? So you can, wherever you are around the world, whatever location you're in, you can always sign up for a class. If you're in a remote office, we will actually do WebEx only or Blue Jeans only courses. So we never want to have a mixture of local people and remote people. We will do remote only classes. We have different content for that because it's generally more presentation style as opposed to whiteboards or other things. It does require some different things. But the Tech Talks, again, provided via Twitter University, it's always external people that are coming in and challenging us with new ideas. You can sign up to it, you can rock up and join us in the auditorium, or you can watch it on live stream if you're in one of the other offices. Just recently we actually had Jeff Sutherland come in. I wasn't actually able to attend, I was here in Sydney, but he came in and gave a tech talk and was sharing some stuff. But some of the recent things I wanted to, like totally unrelated, using Twitter to tackle flooding and infrastructure challenges in Jakarta, modern database systems, modernized classic systems, new SQL, no SQL, the W3C and what's next for the web security model, online experiments, A/B testing, charting collections of connections in social media. Like, you get all sorts of stuff. My favorite talk was actually from a research fellow from Microsoft who talked about satisfying intent. He also talked, interestingly enough, a lot about, he was from Seattle, he talked a lot about smoking pot and music and grunge and Nirvana, but the satisfaction of intent was this really amazing talk that he gave, interspersed amongst everything else. The final part is flocks. And so the flocks, these are similar, as I understand it, to the guilds at Spotify that Henrik spoke about yesterday. Flocks are advertised, again, via the Twitter University tool. People can sign up for them, but these are very much not a course, they're more like an internal tech talk, right? Someone internally will come through. So for instance, for the Agile flock, we have, you know, how the Crashlytics team gets shit done. You know, we have how the Gazebo team gets shit done. The Get Shit Done series is a pretty popular one, right? Like, people come along because they're interested to learn how does this other team work. We had one of the teams, and the key theme of their Get Shit Done talk was actually around DevOps and how they were doing it for internal applications for their internal customers. So similar to the guilds that you're probably familiar with that Henrik talked about. Over lunch, generally, bit of a presentation, Q&A, forum, things like that. So how are we constantly training and improving the flock? We've got women in engineering to enhance the diversity and bring up more empathy around women in engineering. We've got the Twitter University, of course, the tech talks, the external people coming in, and finally the flocks themselves. We're hopefully always on the cusp of new technology, introducing new ideas to the Twitter people, and making sure that all this stuff is recorded so people can refer back to it in the future. So we've looked at how we hire people, how we get our people productive, how we conduct performance reviews, and finally how we improve the flock. We've found, so again at Twitter, we've found these are some of the key aspects around our people that help us maintain, encourage, and support high-performance teams. And like, I want to leave you with this note again, right? Here be dragons. You know, this is our experience. It's what's worked for us. As you can see, there's a couple of things in here that we're experimenting with. We're exploring. Some of our experiments work really well. Some of them, yeah, we just discard them. They weren't successful. But we have a hypothesis that this change around, for instance, Twitter Core 5 with the people management training will improve the results of our pulse survey around a particular aspect of that. And in fact, it did satisfy that. Now, it took us a long time to get the results of that experiment, but it was our way of doing continuous improvement on our organisation. So take a little bit from what you've learned here today, I hope, and indeed over the past 2 days from all the other talks. Learn what others have tried, failed, and succeeded with, and experiment at your own company with your own problems. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And Now, I think I've got time to answer questions now, but there's also, we've got the panel later as well with Henrik.
Yeah. So probably do 10, 15 minutes questions.
Yeah, so if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
Hi, your recruiting process actually looks fairly normal for that sort of San Francisco Bay Area company. How do you order groupthink and only hiring clothes? How do you get that diversity of experience and background?
Yeah, I think that, sorry to repeat the question. Fairly standard hiring practice for Silicon Valley. How do you overcome this, I suppose, the bias of the people that you've already got, bringing in people that are similar to themselves? Long story short, it's challenging. We have tried things like gender-blind resume reviews early on in the process. We found that, you know, obviously you can't do gender-blind through the entire process, but gender-blind resume reviews. So everyone's familiar with the story of the orchestra, and the orchestra doing reviews of new musicians to join the orchestra. They put the musician on the other side of a panel so that the judges couldn't see whether the musician was male or female. It actually led to a huge increase in the number of women that were joining orchestras. And I believe this was from Vienna, but now rolled out more globally. We tried that with the resume reviews. We found it wasn't really very effective. People would kind of read into it and, oh, is it a man, is it a woman? I want to know, right? So it was kind of really difficult to get over that. We actually found the education, merely the education about trying to put that to one side actually improved I suppose the percentage of women that get down the pipeline, that hiring funnel. There's been a lot written about it recently. In fact, one of my colleagues wrote an article recently. He blogged about, he's actually a black gentleman, and he talked about, you know, there's all this women in engineering, great, but what about other streams of diversity and really important, and about the biases? I think as an industry, we're trying to address it. We don't have answers today, but the first step for Twitter was actually publishing, along with Apple, Facebook, Google, etc., the gender diversity data. Yeah, so that's ongoing, definitely. Yes?
Have you come across any complacency in teams having kind of picked their working process and then not wanting to kind of really try any new things? Like, have you come across that, and if you have, how have you prodded that out of them?
Yeah, so the question is, have you come across teams that are, you know, perhaps happy with their process or settled into their process and not interested or willing to try new things? We've certainly come across that. In fact, there's scenarios where perhaps an engineering director would say, hey, you know what, I'd really like you to spend some time with this team. Perhaps they're not as effective as the other teams. Sometimes you find that it's the approach, or they're overwhelmed, the work, things like that, and you have to tease it out. Sometimes they're just not receptive at all. Generally, we have this kind of, we'll just let them be, right? We've got enough things to work on, enough other teams to focus on, that we can focus on, that want to get better. We can focus on them, and then, you know, once we've got enough momentum with all these other teams that are working really well, the tide will, or, you know, the momentum will drag these other teams along with them. That's the approach that we've taken, yeah. Certainly no mandate, nothing, like no forced intervention or anything like that, yeah. Hello.
With the 6 to 7 interviews that you had back-to-back, what types of activities have you put in place to capture really good people talent and also a cultural match for Twitter?
Yeah, so I think this is perhaps, sorry, the question is, you know, with these interviews, with the interview process, how do you capture not just the people that are suitable for the team, but the people that are also suitable for the culture? One of the things that we do on our on-site interview when we get people into the office, they generally do 3 interviews in the morning, back-to-back, and they will be with, you know, again, someone from that hiring panel. Then they go and they break for lunch, and they have lunch with someone perhaps from the team, someone from a totally different team. One of the things that we found impacted women getting through the funnel, for instance, was we found that pairing up a woman for lunch with another woman was a lot more effective, right? The women would just get turned off. They're having a lunch with an egotistic, fella that only wants to talk about himself and isn't interested. But the lunch interview is really that cultural one. We don't actually call it an interview, but I suppose, they're still part of the hiring panel, but it's more cultural. Like, do you have any questions? How about family? Things like that, like locations. Do you have to move? Things like that. It's much more the softer sort of aspects as opposed to the team-focused fit. Yeah. Hello.
You mentioned your teams are stable. How long do your teams stay together? Do you rotate people between teams?
So you mentioned the teams are stable. How long do the teams stay together, and do you rotate people between teams? So we like to see teams that are stable for the long term, right? And I would say I want them to be stable ideally for 12, 18 months or longer. I know that it's going to take a time for a group of people to get together and gel so that they really become high performance, right? Even with all those traits that we talked about, even if they exhibited those within a month, they're not going to be a high performance team, right? However, we do also offer opportunities for people to branch out, what we call, again, we're in a tree, we've got birds, branch out. That allows you to go from your team and join Jason's team, for instance. And generally what we might do in that scenario is you would swap with someone else in that team. Now, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you might go, oh, look, I want to get out of the world of Scala. I want to turn my hand at I want to go do Python and try something different, right? And so you might just go to another team where there isn't a good swap. But if there was a good swap, then we'd certainly try and approach it like that for perhaps 3 months or an ongoing basis where you would just move to that team.
What do you do with non-performers?
What do we do with non-performers?
That seems thorough, but people must slip through the cracks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what do we do with non-performers?
Do they get moved sideways to somebody else's team?
I would hope that non-performers do not get moved sideways.
That never happens.
Yeah,
Somebody said here you clip their wings.
you clip their wings. Yeah. No, because if we clip their wings, then they'd be stuck with us forever. We want to free them to fly and find another flock to join, perhaps. No, I don't know. I haven't really had to deal with non-performers directly in any way, so I'm not sure how to comment on that. I'm sorry.
Primary source for the turkeys.
Yes, hello.
360-degree questionnaire, does individual team create their own?
No, sorry. So just on the 360-degree individual feedback, is that standard across the company? And yes, the 360-degree interview is standard across the whole company. The time frame is standard across the whole company. Different groups might actually... so for instance, the time frame is around, okay, on the 1st of November, we start the 360-degree review. The first week is I will go out and I will pick the people that I would like to get some feedback from. The following 3 days of the next week, my manager will review those and he might add some more people to my list. And then basically the following week after that, it's open, right? It's open for a week and everyone's got to get their feedback in. You shouldn't have, as an individual, you shouldn't be asked for any more than, say, 6 or 7 different, to provide feedback on 6 or 7 other people. As a manager, you're generally going to get asked to provide feedback on 12, 14 people or different roles, like technical program managers, for instance. They work with a lot of different people across these large programs, a number of different teams. They generally give feedback for a lot of people and get and ask for feedback from a number of people as well. But yeah, the process, the timing, the questions, standard across the whole company. Yeah. Hello, yes.
Yeah, just to repeat what someone else said, is your hiring process is sort of reasonably orthodox and common across some of these big companies behind you. 360 reviews, the pulse reviews, they're all, a lot of
Fairly common.
companies are quite familiar with them. But at the same time, you said you never really had an underperformer or you don't really deal with it. I think all these people in Westpac and Commonwealth may have a different experience where they have got underperformers. What do you think the factor is at Twitter that isn't in these other organisations that's working?
So you mentioned some large companies here, and I believe the large companies that you meant, the question was, sorry to repeat the question for the video. we have some fairly standard practices at Twitter. They're practices that other large companies exhibit, yet we don't really have to deal with a whole lot of underperformance in our tweets. And what's the difference between other large companies that use these practices and perhaps Twitter? Formulate an answer. I think we have a lot, like the people that we hire are passionate, right? The people that we hire are passionate about the product. They're passionate about giving a voice to people across the world, right? And that's perhaps something that's unique to us. I wonder whether, you know, people that work for a bank are passionate about making sure that, you know, that newlywed couples can get a mortgage, right? So the people that work at Twitter are very passionate about giving a voice to people around the world, making sure that underprivileged people or women in oppressed countries like Saudi Arabia can have a voice, for instance. So I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is we don't have contractors. So everyone is a full-time employee. Everyone has access. You know, you are part of the flock, right? Like, you are here. But we try and, you know, we try and make sure that we're getting the right people in the door that are passionate, that are the right fit. And of course, once they're in the door, they're here for life, sort of thing. Like, they are part of the flock, as opposed to, you know, some other companies that you described. They may outsource, whether it be locally or to other countries overseas. And so I think there's probably a different culture when you've got some outsourced people versus employees. I can give you an example of that. I spoke with another company in San Francisco. They do a lot of similar things to what we do, but they actually have about a split of about 50-50 between employees and contractors. Now, I would talk about things that we provide to our employees, like, for instance, hack days. You know, we do a hack week. What's another example? Like, you know, we take them to events and conferences and picnics and things like that. Now, in her scenario, they've got, you know, 2,000 people in product and engineering. If she does that, 1,000 people she can't invite to the picnic. Like, she actually says, if I go and give them an umbrella because it's raining, like, I actually have legal repercussions because now they're treated as an employee. And so in that scenario, she's got two different classes of, you know, people in the team. And I think that causes some friction in the culture. I suppose the passion and that are probably two things that I immediately come to mind, yeah. Hello.
Hey Nick, just wondering if Twitter's bloated. I mean, you guys have one product across a lot of platforms, obviously, but you know, over 1,000 people hired last year seems an inordinate amount of employees to bring on to support one product.
Okay, so the question is Twitter bloated? Does Twitter have too many people? And actually, I should follow on from that and say for the video that the comment was that Twitter has one product. I suppose we have a product, and that product is on iOS and Android, but we do actually have other products. We do have, you know, you are perhaps a user of Twitter, the iOS app, and you use it like a number of other million people around the world. But then we do have other customers, like publishers, and we have different products for those audiences. So we do have a number of products in the market. If you look at our operation in London, for instance, we have an engineering organisation in London, and they're focused on one product, which is called TweetDeck, which is targeted more at advanced Twitter users, which is generally newsrooms, publishers, things like that. So when my assessment, my sense is that we're not bloated. My sense is that we are certainly becoming a more effective organisation. We grew very quickly, and growth has pains associated with it. Growth has a lot of, you don't add people and automatically get more velocity out the other end, right? Like, you add people and your velocity, you double the number of, well, we more than double, but you grow this organisation so fast, and the velocity, like, it slows down dramatically. But of course, 6 or 8, 12 months after that, your velocity is much greater. And so I think the growth was certainly the right decision at the time. It's given us a lot more velocity this year. Yeah. And folks, that's all we got time for, because we're going to set up and come back here to chat with Henrik and Colin shortly. Thanks for your time.